We are now going to begin with a spotlight on the art of partnerships. Neera, are you there already?
Bain's mission, both globally and in India, is to drive transformative social impact by applying Bain talent in partnership with the most innovative and effective organizations in the social sector, addressing some of the world's most pressing issues. We partner with organizations that have pioneered and scaled models of change that demonstrably work, but which often lack access to the type of strategic consulting that Bain can provide to help them reach full potential. This is why our 10-year commitment to invest $1 billion in pro bono consulting work globally will have transformative impact. In India, Bain Company has had the privilege of partnering with organizations like Magic Bus, Akshaya Patra, Acumen, Kailash Satyarthi and Dasra.
Dasra is extremely grateful for this privilege of partnership that includes thought leadership on the Indian Philanthropy Report and ongoing strategic insight to achieve our full potential, and Shrek has been part of both of these for almost 10 years. It also gives me great pride to announce our newest addition to the Dasra leadership team, Anant, Bhagwati, a former partner who led India's digital and social impact practice, who has joined as Director of Capability Building at Dasra. Both Deval and I must personally thank Karan Singh, who's the head of Bain India, and Arpan Sheth, who is a partner at Bain, but also a board member of Dasra, for supporting this transition. We really believe this will accelerate Dasra's full potential. Please join me in welcoming him to the Dasra family and launching India Philanthropy Report. Thank you.
So this is the toughest slot anyone can get after a good lunch, warm afternoon, and so hopefully I will not put you completely to sleep. And there is a set of questions. My name is Anant. I've had the privilege of getting to know some of you. I have been associated in part-time capacity for the last 5 years with some of you, Dasra, Magic Bus, Acumen, but then now have had the courage to move full-time into this space. This is, as you know, the Philanthropy Report has been a State of the Union report every year between Bain and Dasra, looking at very objectively using data, what's really happening, and playing it back and trying to separate the rhetoric from the reality. And hopefully you will see a little bit of this as well. The way we have structured it is a very quick run-through of some of the facts. The report is going to be loaded on the app. And as you can guess, there are certain facts which we'd love to highlight. And then there is Q&A. My request would be, as you go through this, if there are any facts which either ring true or like, wow, I didn't know that, think of that. And as we do the Q&A, it'll be great to get some reflections back. Lastly, there is a one-page infographic, so that pretty much is the only concession on what could be printed, which will be given to you after we finish this quick run-through and before the Q&A. So that might be useful to, again, refer back to the most important facts which is coming through. So the title is Time to Up Our Game. It's been a great journey so far. Clearly, many things have worked very, very positively. But as you'll see, there is a big journey to make. And what has got us so far won't get us to our destination. So that's the first assertion. So it is actually time for the whole sector to up our game, and we'll talk a little bit about why. So the one thing which is great is, yes, the sector is growing. There is more funds coming in. And as has always been the case, you'd recall even the last year, private funding has increased at a slightly faster rate than public funding as a percentage. What's interesting, though, is if you were to look at this, the averages always hide the true picture. So as you start unpeeling, there are certain very interesting facts behind it. But the first headline message is, yes, the sector is growing. And we see the same trend around total private versus total public growing together, with private slightly growing faster. So that's the first message. I think the thing which you'll notice is, even as you look at the central funding, there is a very, very strong intent we are seeing around more funds being put in, but in a slightly more concerted way around programs by the government. So one of the big changes which has happened is, at least the government has fully embraced how SDGs are being spoken about. We heard in the morning from Francine around why SDGs are important. For those of us, like who's not aware of what is SDG? Just raise your hand. I know it's maybe I should have asked the other way around. Look, if the government of India can align on certain goals, I think it's pretty obvious that the rest of the country needs to. SDGs are those goals which have been committed in a public fora that India will do its very best to achieve by 2030. The reason it's important is resources are limited, and there is a way to channel the energy in a way that actually outcomes get met. And the first thing which is interesting and important is, while funds are going up, there is a very strong realization, at least on the government's part, that SDGs are the direction to go. So I do want you to take that second message through. Having said that, the thing which is really shocking, and this, I don't know whether, I'd love to ask how many of you know this data. If you were to look at between 2016 and 18 or 2014 and 18, and again, look at different data cuts, look at SDG ranking, or look at other rankings around Human Development Index, we have not moved the needle. So it's a great story of a lot of action, a lot of inputs, and a lot of voice and a lot of noise, but really, where are the results, right? And where are the results in a way that we can actually say we have moved the needle in a way which is tangible and externally validated? So it's useful to keep an eye on what's really going on as a sector when we start comparing to other countries in terms of where we stand. And one of the core reasons why this is so important, and this is the one slide which I'd love you to almost keep in mind, over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years, over the next 30 years, market forces will make sure that a very large number of people will automatically move out of poverty. So we heard the number, right, in the morning, 240 million have actually already moved out of poverty, simply because as the economy grows, it lifts, all boats start going up with the rising tide. But the interesting reality is, if you just fast forward it, look at the current economic status of 1.2 billion Indians and actually do the modeling, we essentially will be left with a diamond. What that basically means is we'll have a huge and prosperous middle class, we'll have ultra-rich, and then we'll have ultra-poor. So market forces in themselves are insufficient, necessary but insufficient to actually solve the problem of poverty. And this is critical because if this is a situation in 2050 where there is a large number of people who have a lot of money, an even larger number of people who have sufficient money, and a large number of people who are extremely distressed, this will basically fracture the society. So market forces alone can solve part of the problem, but there is the red part on the right-hand side, 330 million people who will actually not break the cycle of poverty unless they get a helping hand. And that's basically where where we have to move the needle. So it's not a nice to do, it's not a theoretical point, it's a very practical reality of, are we going to be left with the structure on the right-hand side, or will we actually have a slightly more equitable situation after 20, 30 years? And the reason it's important to up the game is because even if you were to look at some of the SDGs, now this is all the SDGs, but if you were to think of the ones which are almost the human right-oriented SDGs, like hunger, gender, malnutrition, some of the things which I think all of us agree have to be solved, right? Even if you take 5 of them, there is a significant funding gap after adding an optimistic scenario of government funding and an optimistic scenario of today's trends. So imagine a situation where if nothing is done, we will be left with a situation where there will be a fractured society. To do something, there is a quantum of money required, and obviously that money is going to come in from multiple sources, but there is going to be a gap. So what do you do in that situation? And if we don't solve this, the issue is almost 1/5 of the world's SDG gap is actually India. So if you were to look at it from an India lens, this rings true. But even if you were to look at it from a global person who's trying to solve gender, right? If you look at the row on gender, which is the fifth one from the left, 29% of the gap, the global gap to the SDG on gender is driven by India. So you actually cannot solve the global problem unless you solve India. And of course, India will be in really bad shape if we cannot solve this problem with speed. So I think the need to solve the problem is, it's obvious to many of them here, and even the data indicates that. The key question is, how do you bridge the gap between a shortage of funds and a reality that we have to solve the problem at scale? And we did hear this a lot in the earlier session as well, on scale as well. So here are some thoughts, right? While wealth has grown in the country, one of the realities is, apart from one large singular contribution, if you actually start looking at the contributions coming up at more than 10 crores, that's actually contracted. Okay? So it's a situation where the country is getting wealthier, but the money is actually not flowing directly into philanthropy. And it's not very, it sounds counterintuitive, but if you were to just imagine it at a granular level, the more I get money, unless I have the vehicles to think big, I will still revert to my traditional ways of giving, which is, okay, let me give money to one NGO close to my house, let me give money to one school close to my house. That mindset is not keeping pace with the pace at which the economy is growing. So what that's leading to is interesting divergence between wealth creation and wealth giving or sharing of wealth. And we try to look at how this actually will play out if we were to globally benchmark ourselves. So this is showing how the wealth is distributed in India, right? So there are families with extremely high wealth. There are about 100 families with more than 1.4 billion net worth. And then there are about 800 families with very, very significant wealth. If you were to benchmark with how these families, similar kind of levels of wealth, give part of their net wealth into private philanthropy, and it could be on any cause. If you were to look at the US, that's usually at a weighted average of about 3%. That means if I'm in the ultra rich, I usually give 3% of my accumulated net worth into private philanthropic causes. In India, if you look at that upper two layers, and if you were to take that one notable contribution out, we would be hovering at close to 0.1 to 0.2%. So it's shocking that in India, we are almost 30x lower on a comparable metric. And it's important for us to recognize that while there is a lot of celebration and rhetoric around how giving is growing up, if you unpeel, actually we are losing share of how much giving is going up as a percentage of net worth. And it's important to address this because, look, the country will become massive in terms of economy, but if this doesn't keep pace, that some of those benefits will not come to the poor. So if you looked at the one big message is, frankly, with our concerted effort and creating the avenues for the right kind of evacuation, there is an opportunity for much, much more significant giving, and it's up to all of us to make sure the accountability in the sector is able to pick that. I think the second point is CSR, right? There's a lot of rhetoric around the 2%, it's great. Do we know that close to 15% of the budget is actually unspent every year? And unfortunately today, CSR is completely driven by an audit mindset. It's not driven by a strategic mindset. So again, the point is there is a small quantum of money. It's all adding up to 10 billion. But if even within that, there is some part left unspent and some part which actually goes again into fragmented giving, that again goes away from creating the impact. So what do? It sounds like a little bit of a gloomy picture, right? Saying a big problem and some of the fragmented issues. So we looked at how some of the other large movements have actually solved the situation. And I think there were some very interesting, you've heard of many of these movements, because are there some learnings which can be adopted by India to actually move and solve these problems at scale? I just speak about 5 of these learnings and then open it for Q&A. I think the first big learning, and this is like unambiguous, any large field movement which has generated a large amount of capital, shown results, it's non-negotiable to have a bold outcome at the center. If a bold outcome, and I'm not saying an input and I'm not saying output, it has to be a bold, measurable outcome which tingles it basically makes us get goosebumps. That's absolutely at the center of every large movement. So that's important. The second one is a very data-led approach towards advocacy and execution. If the work we are doing is not impacting government either around advocacy, policy, or execution of policy, again, it misses the trick because the largest single engine which is implementing stuff is the government of India. We spoke a lot about collaborative action. I think it's about making sure that collaboration is happening at the front line, so I'll not belabor that point. We talked about government allies. I think the last one is design for scale. What does scale mean? I mean, the way I'd flip it to you is if it can't scale to at least one state, there is a problem. Because in India, if you only think of a block or only think of X schools, fundamentally it misses the point around scaling. The reason this is interesting is as we start looking at different movements which have been very successful, whether it's been the rollback malaria, it's been campaign to stop tobacco, or even some of the Indian programs around sanitation, HIV, Bangladesh, ORS, these 5 things have been at the heart of it. And it doesn't mean that it has to be big giving. It just means whatever the quantum of giving, how can all philanthropists encourage adoption of 1 or 2 or more of these, starting with almost having the field outcomes at the center. So, little bit summarizing, a little bit of mixed messages. There is need for acceleration, there's need for upping the game. There is a real potential to up the game if we start thinking big. But I think the time is now. And what has got us so far will definitely not get us to our end outcome if we have to swing the SDGs by 2030. So I'd want to pause there, and I'd request us to take a look at the handouts which should be circulating through, which is nothing but what is on the page here, and love to get some Q&A going or reflections. Yeah.
So it was interesting. Is there another question first?
No, go first and then Lynn.
Because interesting that the increase in funding went up, but the rate on the Human Development Index didn't go up very much. Is that similar with other countries? Has overall spending in the development sector increased in all of the countries? And is that a similar rate to India?
So you're saying that is the same gap mirrored in some of the other places? So, we haven't looked at benchmarking exactly that, but one of the things we have seen when we looked at India's spend as a percentage of GDP, it's actually under-indexed to pretty much many other countries, whether it's education or health. So there is a little bit of, okay, the right inputs are going in, but yet we have not reached the point where we are moving the needle at scale. So it's like, yeah, inputs are happening, but it's not yet bold enough to actually move the needle at scale, simply because the issue is so big and the number of people are so many out here.
I guess a follow-up question, are there any countries that are, less investments but are making bigger change? Are there any countries to follow the lead, or countries that are doing particularly good in this area?
So there are programs. So more than a country, we have seen programs which are, so HIV has been one of those, which irrespective of the country has actually made a big leap. But it's more programmatic than a country itself. And India is a little hard to compare because the scale of the poor population in India is actually so different from anyone else that the need for scale and the need for being bold is almost becoming critical and non-negotiable here. Otherwise, we might end up doing the same thing for a long time, but actually not move the needle in our lifetime. Lynn?
Hi, I'm Lynn Smitham from the Kiowa Trust.
Hi.
I think it's really important for us as philanthropists to align what we're working on with the SDGs, because that's the only way that we can create a changed world. But one of the things that I'm very aware of is that to work at the sort of scale that's needed to achieve impact on these SDGs requires big programs, big platforms. This is a similar question to one that was asked in a previous panel. A lot of philanthropists I meet are interested in funding things for the very personal feedback that they get around actually seeing the change at the either individual level, or seeing the health improve, or actually really personally experiencing that change and feeling that their funding had done that. So when you're working at this sort of scale, Anand, how do you keep that sense of personal connection so that even if you're working on something massive, you stay motivated?
Yeah. Thanks, Lynn. I think this has been a little bit of the conundrum. But if we look at an example of where this has worked well, I think there is a difference between being very close to the front line, which I think is great. And in fact, that adds so much more insights and feedback loop, versus saying, I will create my system to solve the problem. The latter, in a place like India, is actually doing a huge disservice to solving the real problem, because actually the only system which can solve the problem at scale in India is the government. And then really finding a way to look at what are the breakpoints and almost becoming invisible in the process of solving the breakpoint is important. I want to leave this thought with most people, which is, look, our behavior has been, I'll open a temple, I'll put my name. I'll open a school, I'll put my name. I'll give food, I'll get my name, I'll get my photo. This approach is, forget about our names. Let's be invisible, but let's solve the breakpoints in the system. And of course, we can be at the front lines, we can really focus on what's really going on, but sacrificing the urge to see our name as opposed to solving the problem at scale, I think that's a choice we have to make. And frankly, the more we want to see our individual names, the more collaboration will be harder. So I think this will be a mindset shift over time, but a little bit of that is being comfortable with, as long as the problem's being solved at scale, I actually don't care who gets credit. And it is a mindset shift, but it is important so that big problems can actually be solved, right? Yes, if we can go to the that side, the last gentleman on that side.
Hi, Anant. I'm Sanjay Hazarika from CHRI.
Hi.
A very basic question, because I don't know what the report does in terms of SDG 16, because SDG 16 is like the mother lode of the SDGs. Without transparency, rule of law, good governance, access to justice and information, freedom of media, you're not going to get any of the things that you're talking about. And, I'm really concerned that in the conversation so far, this very fundamental fabric, which all of us see on our streets, all of us see in the papers, in the headlines, in the news we watch, the feeds we read, every day, has not been addressed. I'm sure it will be in the next day or two, but if philanthropies do not put support to human rights defenders, to the rule of law, to enabling those who are supposed to do their duty actually do it and hold them accountable, this will be a major problem. This is a major challenge, and it is something that even major industrialists or smaller businesses have to deal on a daily basis. So, working in that field, this is a question that I feel very strongly about.
No, thanks, Sanjay. And there is, I think, a discussion on this later today. But if I just build on that, but expand a little bit, I think a bit of this is also then choosing the fields which are slightly harder to impact, like moving away from instant gratification is the second thing which will be required. For example, when you work on an adolescent, you work for 6 years, and then finally you see the complete fruits of your labor, right? It's quite different from instant gratification. So I think a little bit of this is also the behavior change on not only not wanting credit personally, but being committed for duration and being committed for scale. Because without duration and scale, we cannot solve some of these tougher problems actually meaningfully. Now again, it sounds like a departure from where we are, but what we see is programs are existent in India who are doing this, but they are few and far between. So if you look at the call to action, and I know I have got the stop sign, so I have to stop, but I guess the one thing I want to leave this group with is it possible for everyone to, in their own capacity to actually talk about what, and go and discuss with whoever you work with, at least one or two of the field approach elements. And if there's one element to start with, I was at the leadership program yesterday, Dasra ran, outcomes measurable outcomes at the center, not inputs and not outputs. Because moment you start thinking that, moment one can start actually driving accountability into the system. So, just in summary, I'd request you to, keep that one-page infographic with you. But even within that, out of the 5 things which seem to work, the first one is a great place to start. And, my request is, if you can ask that question to anyone you work with, if you're an NGO, ask it to yourself. If you're a funder, ask it to your NGO. If you're a government, ask it to the people who are working with you. That can actually trigger a whole set of conversations and actions behind it. So thank you, folks, for your time, and all the best.